Hello, folks. Welcome. For those of you that do not know, I think I recognize all your faces, or most all your faces. My name is Sonia McElveen. I am one of the leadership team for the Union County chapter of the North Carolina Wildlife Federation. Yeah, that's a long name. Now you know why we use a small one. Welcome. Everybody you came. And I am fairly certain you all have been here before. If not, I can tell you where the restrooms are and where the water fountain is. Anybody need to know? Emergency exits. I'm sure y'all know where the closest exit is to, and if not, for some reason, just follow us. We'll point you in the right direction. Yeah. So without further ado, because you didn't come here to listen to me talk, you came here to listen about invasive insects. I'm going to turn it over to Erika. She is more than capable of introducing herself, and a whole lot better than I am, so I'm going to let her do that.
Thank you all for coming. My name is Erika Niland. I'm a professor over at Wingate University. I'm also the chair of the biology department. My specialty is in entomology and plant pathology. I got both of my degrees in that because I love fungi. So with entomology, it sort of piqued my interest. I use fungi to control insects. That's really my sort of main specialty, but I've kind of, as I continued my research, it's kind of moved into other places, and so I'm going to talk a little bit about that tonight. But I'm excited to talk about invasive insects, and I will spend a little bit of time on kudzu bugs, because those are near and dear to my heart. But at any point, if you have a question about a certain insect, please let me know, and we can chat about it. So if we look just overall, if we're talking about pests, this could be animals, it can be plants, it can be many things. But it's really anything that can cause harm to the economy. So a lot of it's usually driven by agronomic crops. How are we losing money and how are we losing food? It could also be ecology, which I think a lot of you have come here tonight. How does the imbalance of an ecosystem occur when you have these invasive insects? And then it could also be human health. A prime example of an invasive insect that's especially worrisome for human health is a lot of the different types of mosquitoes. That the Asian tiger mosquito is actually an invasive mosquito and is known to harbor and vector some infectious diseases. Now, as far as invasives, what makes them special? Well, they're really able to thrive and establish their populations in areas that is pretty broad. So it makes it a little bit difficult to control. They can tolerate a bunch of different types of environmental conditions, whether it's drought, whether it's too much water, whether it's cold, whether it's hot. They don't really have a preference. They'll try their best to maintain their populations at that level. And then lastly, they're able to disperse really well. And I'm going to use for a lot of these examples, the kudzu bug, because it's known to do all of these things. And it's a great example of how quickly an invasive can go from showing up overnight to pretty much taking over a habitat. Go ahead.
We're having an issue with forwarding the moving the slides when you're changing online, just to let you know. We're working on technical difficulties.
Okay. Do you want me to keep going, or?
I would say keep going.
So I know a lot of people usually when I talk about invasive insects, especially, they like to ask me the question, what's the difference between invasive and introduced species? And so if we look at invasive species and introduced species, they're two separate things. History gives us a little bit of a story of how sometimes that not necessarily be the case, and we think we kind of associate them both together. The first one, prime example that we all probably know of, is kudzu. So kudzu is all over the place. It's considered an invasive species, but it was actually introduced into the United States. Interestingly enough, it was introduced in the early 1900s. It was gathered a lot of interest of farmers, and there was a particular farmer down in Florida that suggested, well, you could plant kudzu and you could use that as a forage crop for ruminants. Then you have the US government, which was a soil conservatory, use kudzu on roadsides and other places to stop erosion of soil. Works great to stop erosion, but it opened up a plethora of issues later on, right? So we have it invading a lot of our natural habitats, forests. Can even be, at this point, there's a lot of kudzu close to roads that could also impact some farming areas. So it can easily spread, it can spread pretty quickly. And so we know that that is an example of an introduced species that is now an invasive. Another example where it's not as sort of dramatic as kudzu overtaking ecosystems is the multicolored or spotted Asian lady beetle or ladybird beetle. You may purchase these if you're an avid gardener. It's a great predator. It will eat aphids. And so that is a picture of Lewis Ketters. I actually got to work with him. He was a scientist down at USDA in Byron, Georgia. And he works exclusively in biological control of pecan orchards. And he thought bringing Harmonia here, we could release it. It would be a great way to control some of these pest populations. Well, if you look in the autumn time, you usually notice that there's a lot of bird beetles in your house. And it's really more so a nuisance pest. So it does work well in predating on these aphids, but on the flip side, it ends up in people's homes, right? Usually not a big deal for most people. But Harmonia has this weird thing in that it holds a lot of hemoglobin or like insect blood. And what it can do, if it feels like it's threatened, it begins to bleed out of its exoskeleton. And it's a really foul odor. Then you get to the point that it gets embedded into drywall and things like that. And so it's really more so, it's not going to cause any type of human health issue, but it's more so just a pain when it's in your house.
Do you see spots? Is that the bleeding we talked about?
It can be, yeah. So I know a lot of people usually when I talk about invasive insects, especially, they like to ask me the question, what's the difference between invasive and introduced species? And so if we look at invasive species and introduced species, they're two separate things. History gives us a little bit of a story of how sometimes that not necessarily be the case, and we think we kind of associate them both together. The first one, prime example that we all probably know of is kudzu. So kudzu is all over the place. It's considered an invasive species, but it was actually introduced into the United States. Interestingly enough, it was introduced in the early 1900s. It was gathered a lot of interest of farmers, and there was a particular farmer down in Florida that suggested, well, you could plant kudzu and you could use that as a forage crop for ruminants. Then you have the US government, which was a soil conservatory, use kudzu on roadsides and other places to stop erosion of soil. Works great to stop erosion, but it opened up a plethora of issues later on, right? So we have it invading a lot of our natural habitats, forests. Can even be, at this point, there's a lot of kudzu close to roads that could also impact some farming areas. So it can easily spread, it can spread pretty quickly. And so we know that that is an example of an introduced species that is now an invasive. Another example where it's not as sort of dramatic as kudzu overtaking ecosystems is the multicolored or spotted Asian lady beetle or ladybird beetle. You may purchase these if you're an avid gardener. It's a great predator. It will eat aphids. And so that is a picture of Lewis Ketters. I actually got to work with him. He was a scientist down at USDA in Byron, Georgia. And he works exclusively in biological control of pecan orchards. And he thought bringing Harmonia here, we could release it. It would be a great way to control some of these pest populations. Well, if you look in the autumn time, you usually notice that there's a lot of bird beetles in your house. And it's really more so a nuisance pest. So it does work well in predating on these aphids, but on the flip side, it ends up in people's homes, right? Usually not a big deal for most people. But Harmonia has this weird thing in that it holds a lot of hemoglobin or like insect blood. And what it can do, if it feels like it's threatened, it begins to bleed out of its exoskeleton. And it's a really foul odor. Then you get to the point that it gets embedded into drywall and things like that. And so it's really more so, it's not going to cause any type of human health issue, but it's more so just a pain when it's in your house.
Do you see spots? Is that the bleeding we talked about?
It can be, yeah. So reflex bleeding, what they do is on the bottom side, They have their different sclerites on their exoskeletons, what are those segments that you see? And what they can do is push the hemolymph or that blood around their legs where their cocci go in there and around those sternites. And so then it will come out. The idea is that, you know, it would deter predation because, you know, when you have some type of liquid come out of an animal, it usually means that there's something bad. It doesn't really do much. I mean, it can cause a skin rash. A lot of insects can do that, but it's really just foul smelling. So that one is kind of like, it's not necessarily a big deal and really it causes an imbalance in the ecosystem, but it was one of those introduced and now it's just kind of a pain in the butt to have around, although it is beneficial in some regard. The next one are forward flies or decapitating flies, Pseudodactylium. These specific flies are parasitic to fire ants. Great, right? Haven't come across somebody that likes fire ants. But these were an example of an introduction, but they're not invasive, right? So they have a niche. Fire ants are invasive. We have a way to control them using a natural parasitoid wasp that is native to South America where the fire ants are from. A scientist down at the USDA station in Gainesville, Walker Jones, is a really famous biological control expert that focuses on wasps and flies to use against these sort of invasive species that we ended up having. That's all to say with this history that when we introduce something, there are a lot of layers and there are a lot of licenses and there's a lot of permits that you have to have, and then a lot of scientific data that you have to present to say the benefits of introducing this species outweighs the risks. So if we had known that for kudzu, it could be that maybe we wouldn't see kudzu and kudzu wouldn't be here. I would be a little bit sad and remiss because my kudzu bugs are associated with kudzu. But now with the forward flies, that's a beneficial way that we have now a natural balance of the fire ants. With any type of biological control, it doesn't wipe them all out, but it helps to maintain the balance of the population. So over time, they aren't exploiting all of the resources. Now, if we look and sort of make a list of why invasive species are problematic, I just explained some of the introductory or introduced species. Some of them more of a problem, some of them not. But why they are a problem is often when they make their way into a new area, they don't bring diseases, they don't bring predators, they don't bring those parasites or parasitoids with them. So their population can just continue to grow and goes unchecked. And then that means that they can exploit space and nutrients that native species would otherwise be occupying. And so that overall sort of disrupts the ecology or the ecosystem in a balance tilted more so towards the invasive. Not necessarily that it's a rule of thumb, but some of these invasive insects have like a really high reproduction rate. So it also helps them to sort of outcompete those native species as well. And then through the ecosystem, you know, they could be feeding on plants that are very important. Like the case of fire ants, they're omnivores. So sometimes they'll feed on seeds or they'll take seeds that are typically moved about by different ant species to flourish. But the fire ants ruin the seeds and then the seeds can't germinate. And then also there's other cases where it could cause an imbalance of diseases. It could cause an imbalance of insect populations. So you may have more of one type of pest versus the other. So there's a lot of ecological instability that occurs when you have invasives. Now, as far as invasives, we've come a long way in it, even the last 10 years, by having a lot of monitoring agencies and citizen science. So really the citizen sciences was developed in probably the last 10 to 15 years that really helped these different surveillance agencies be able to monitor invasive species much better. So the first one is the United States Department of Agriculture has specifically a department called Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service. It's usually abbreviated as APHIS. This particular agency is looking at ports and airports for any type of invasive that may be present within goods Or it could even be when you come back and forth from international travel. One of the main things when you go through customs is, do you have any types of fruits or vegetables? Do you have any plants, on any types of plants? Have you been to any farms? And I take a group of students every couple of years to Italy, and we tour a bunch of farms. And I'm like, well, this is gonna be interesting going through customs with 30 students. And I'm like, yeah, we did all those things. But the idea there is that they want to make sure that you're not bringing seeds in that shouldn't be, you're not bringing diseases or insects that might be in that piece of fruit that's native to Europe, but now it's invasive here. So that's more so for agricultural type of holdings. For our national and state parks, we have the Department of Interior. They have what's called the National Invasive Species Council. So this council is really monitoring all the invasive species that might be present in national and state parks to make sure that they're not taking over these different areas. And a lot of what I've just explained is there's this sort of the human interaction to this piece where humans have the ability to sort of move around these invasive species, not intentionally, but it's usually there as we move about. This is one of the reasons why when you go camping, you're told not to bring firewood. And that's part of the reason why we have sort of an issue with the emerald ash borer that I'm going to talk about. A lot of those boring insects are associated with wood, and you're really moving them around, not just the wood. As just an individual, USDA has the National Invasive Species Information Center. So you can go to this website and you basically can look around to see what invasives are around, what do we have here. This first link here is the Early Detection and Distribution Mapping System. This was developed by the University of Georgia, and I am biased because that's where I got my degrees, my graduate degrees. But interestingly enough, I was not necessarily a part of making the map, but the kudzu bug group that was looking at the spread of kudzu bugs, all of those folks, including my major professor for my master's degree, they developed this mapping system. And they developed sort of the early citizen science of, tell us if you've seen a kudzu bug. And that's the way that we were able to track the progression and the movement of the kudzu bug. And so now they're using this, fast forward 15 years later, we're using this mapping system with the USDA so that you could submit something and say, what is this? Then you will have a professional identify it. So we'll have the GPS coordinates, we'll have the time it was observed, we'll have the date of when it was submitted. And so you can jump onto a management strategy much quicker if you were to find an invasive species. So rather than me talk this whole time, and hopefully this works online too, I want us to kind of play around with this a little bit. So if you have a cell phone, you can use this QR code and it's going to jump to the map. And so I would like everybody to kind of look at what invasive species that we might have here in Union County. So it will allow you to search based on states. It will allow you to search based on county. And what the database will provide invasive plants, invasive insects, and diseases, infectious diseases. There's one more thing that I can't remember. So basically, with that database, this is kind of what you would see is sort of the category of, and I just pulled up insects, is what you would get. And then you can request to download the actual information, which I'm going to go and show you what I've downloaded. Sonia, can you see this on your screen?
Yes.
Okay, cool. So if you go to that website and you kind of want to see what has been recorded, this gives you, and I just looked at insects, but you can look at everything, and it shows you the scientific name, the common name, when it was detected, and then it gives you the GPS coordinates, and it gives you the date that it was first described. And so it's a really cool way to keep up with a lot of the invasive components to invasive pests, so that you know exactly where something is, especially as a researcher, it's super helpful. So hopefully that's something you all will eventually use one day. or maybe not. Maybe you'll never see an invasive insect and that will be good.
But it looks like it lets you narrow it down to county too, so.
Mhm.
Really nice.
And that Excel spreadsheet, what I showed you was for Union County. So we don't have a lot of people uploading things is what I took away from it, based on the dates, so. And the other part of that, which is really cool, let me go back to that for a minute, toggle back, is they pull directly from the iNaturalist database for those of you that use iNat. So if you make a query in iNaturalist and you post that it's in Union County, they will go in and pull from it. So that's also helpful too if you use iNaturalist. So it's really cool now how everything, all this technology sort of is working together and talking to each other to develop a database for us. All right, so what I thought I would do is start with a couple of case studies that are pretty famous of invasive insects, and talk a little bit about how we've been able to eradicate them, some of them, and then some of them, they've just now become endemic, meaning that they're here. Should we technically, philosophically call them invasives anymore? Because they've been here for, a very, very long time. So the first one that you guys are probably familiar with, I believe Marshall had the festival on it.
They used to, they changed the name.
Okay. Very good.
I think that's Randy Travis.
Oh, it's Randy, okay, well, Randy Travis is not an invasive insect, so he will not be making this. Is the boll weevil. It's a famous case for eradication. So the boll weevil is native to central Mexico. It likely was introduced in the late 19th century to the United States, mainly in the southwestern United States, and then it moved to the southeastern United States. This is a type of weevil, so it has this really long proboscis here with chewing mouth parts at the bottom. And what it does is it feeds on the flower, essentially the boll, where the cotton will develop. And by doing so, it damages cotton fibers, so then you can't use the cotton. So roughly, with the cost of control to eradicate it and the loss, in that period of time up until the 80s, I believe North Carolina started the eradication program in the 80s, the mid 80s. It cost the United States about $15 billion in both yield losses and control. But the eradication program was extremely successful, and you can see in all of this blue here is where it was completely eradicated, so we no longer have it. The areas that we still have it, well, it's in Mexico, not necessarily the United States, but Mexico still has the boll weevil. And so this is where APHIS is really important to come in and inspect any goods coming from this area to make sure that the boll weevil doesn't get reintroduced again. Now, the downside of this, as far as ecosystems go, I mean, this is an agronomic invasive insect, but a lot of pesticides had to be sprayed. And some of the insecticides were not great. A lot of them were organophosphates, which were derived from mustard gas during the First World War. So they're extremely toxic to humans and birds and aquatics. So there, again, was some indirect damage to the ecosystem, not necessarily by the boll weevil, but by the eradication program. But very successful, and now we don't have to worry about that. Now it's mainly just stink bugs. Another one that we probably all know and either love or hate is the fire ants. So these are the red imported fire ants, Solenopsis invicta. They are native mainly to Central South America. They were introduced into Mobile, Alabama on some goods that came here. And that happened in the early 1900s, was the first sighting of them. Since then, they've been able to colonize in very warm areas. They are considered polymorphic, meaning that they have really small workers, they have medium-sized workers, so there's not really a size you can go about to say this is a fire ant. They do have a colony, so they have a queen. They can have one queen, which is monogyne, more than one queen, which is polygyne. And they really prefer disturbed areas. And so this is a great area essentially in the United States, mainly in the southeast and southwest of the United States, because of the amount of human interaction. So humans cause disturbed areas, that's what fire ants like. So the more that humans are typically around, the more that you have fire ants. They also, when we've talked about invasive species being able to overcome a lot of environmental conditions, this is a picture from Hurricane Harvey, and this is fire ants. It's not a mound, and they have a process known as rafting. So when you have a lot of water come into an area and floods their mound, they will form this raft. They'll kind of all connect together, and you can kind of maybe see that there's some eggs in there too and larvae. The one thing that they do sort of sacrifice are the males. And so all of this are the female workers, and then you may have some eggs and larvae in there too. Now, like I mentioned before, fire ants are omnivores, so they'll kind of scavenge, eat whatever comes into play. Plants, for a lot of plants, they require ant interaction in order to disperse their seeds. Well, with fire ants in that process, they damage the seeds, so they're not really helping disperse those seeds. And by doing so, you're again causing an imbalance in that ecosystem, because now those plants otherwise would have a dispersal system, doesn't. And then lastly, of course, they're very aggressive. So fire ants sting. All ants actually can sting. Some of them are able to have larger stingers that can penetrate with more venom. This here, when the fire ants are in this rafting mode, they will push out more venom. And so it can cause a worse sting. And the reason why they're known as fire ants is because of the toxin, the way that it feels once they sting you. Another example that's really more so an issue up in northeastern United States are gypsy moths. Just recently, the Entomological Society changed it to spongy moths because of the appearance of the caterpillar. It kind of looks more like a sponge. And the reason for this is that the invasive species of Lomantria spar is the European gypsy moth, but there's about 7 other types of gypsy moths that are native to Asia that could potentially be a problem here in the United States. They haven't quite made their way to becoming established, but this is the difference between the Asian and the European. The European's a little bit smaller, the Asian's a little bit larger. The other main difference is the European gypsy moth are native to Europe. The Asian gypsy moths are native to Asia. Their main issue is that they can defoliate tree canopies pretty quickly, which means that they're going to cause an imbalance in our forest ecosystem. They prefer a bunch of these oak, willow, I'm going to read all of those. They also will feed on pines as well, or evergreens. And so that can be an issue when you're talking about the Christmas tree industry, especially in the mountains. And so again, this is going to cause an imbalance in the ecosystem with the amount of animals, with the amount of invertebrates that rely on these trees, not to mention the soil ecosystem of those forests. Now, interestingly enough, so they've been around here a long time too, just like the fire ants as well. And so I think for the most part in entomology, we're kind of moving away from the idea that they're invasive because they've been here for so long. And what we're finding, like with the fire ants, like I told you with the forward flies, we're finding ways in which we now have predators of these invasives or diseases. And another example is with these spongy moths or the gypsy moths. Entomophaga myelomagia is a type of fungus that kills the caterpillars, and it's naturally occurring. A colleague of my major professor in Hayek up at Cornell, she studied this for about 20 years now. And so it's keeping them pretty much in balance and in check. I think the bigger scare is if we also get all of those 7 different types of Asian spongy moths, like how will that then affect the ecosystem, and will they be susceptible to those natural pathogens? So that's sort of just a case study on things that we call invasives, but they've been here for like hundreds of years. So, how should we really technically call them invasives? They've caused quite an issue in those ecosystems, but we're now finding more predators, more parasites, more pathogens that are affecting them since they've been endemic here for so long. So some current invasives that I was just going to kind of cover that might be of interest to this group, and that are certainly still a problem and we're still trying to manage them. The first one is the yellow ash borer that I think pretty much everybody has seen. Pretty much every single one of these invasive species that I'm going to talk about, there is a website and a group dedicated to it, to study it, to learn what it's doing. So the emerald ash borer is not necessarily a really newly introduced invasive. It was first discovered in 2002 in Michigan. It's since made its way all these states in the dark green. We have it. North Carolina, it was established in 2013. And so why it's an issue is that these are wood borers, so they will find essentially ash trees. What they really prefer is green and black ash trees. Once they go through those ash trees, then they will move on to white. Being that this is native to Asia, the Asian ash trees are resistant. Very similar to our blue ash. The blue ash and the Asian ash trees have a high amount of tannins that otherwise the beetle doesn't really like. So the larvae won't feed on it. If we look at the life cycle, this kind of helps us a little bit more determine sort of what's happening. How is it destroying the tree? So between May and September, which is going to be coming up soon in the next month, the emerald ash borer adults will mate. The females will lay eggs in the crevices of the bark on the trees. Then eventually those eggs will hatch into larvae. The larvae look like this. It's kind of like worm-looking structure. And the worms will feed inside of the bark there on the tree in these sort of zigzag kind of looking tunnels. And then in about April or so in that life cycle, they will then pupate into adults. And then they will finally exit the tree, and then this all starts again. So it's damaging the tree and the tree system to the point that the trees are eventually going to die from it. Another issue on top of this is looking at the whole food web, the ecology, is that woodpeckers love this larva. So they will search and find the larva and feed on it, and by doing so damage the tree even more. And then we have to think wholeheartedly that then you are now causing openings, natural openings in the tree that pathogens can potentially get into too. So full circle, not a great system. Now, the emerald ash borer, again, when I talk about invasives, I talk about how they have the ability to overcome great environmental conditions. It's cold to me, it's not really cold in general if you're a tree, but the emerald ash borer can survive very cold temperatures all the way down to -30 degrees. And that's because we have some group of insects that have proteins that are called antifreeze proteins. So it doesn't allow water to freeze. So all of their hemolymph, all of their blood is able to stay liquid even in those cold temperatures. Also looking at the ecology of where those larvae are living, they're underneath the bark, which also provides insulation. So it's almost a fail-proof system that no matter how cold it gets, they would be able to survive. The next one I put up here, we have reports in North Carolina. I'll share about my experience in Pennsylvania visiting family. It's like grape stomping with these spotted lanternflies. So spotted lanternfly is actually not a fly. It's not a moth. It's what we consider a true bug or a hemipteran. It's very similar. So if you've ever seen a cicada is a true bug. This is what, this is associated with a cicada. Has a very long proboscis. It's a phloem feeder. So it sticks that long needle-like projection into the plant or the tree and then takes all the nutrients up. This was first detected in 2014 in Pennsylvania. They've done a pretty good job maintaining it to Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Maryland-ish within the last couple years, but we've had reports of it here in North Carolina this year. It's more going to be an agronomic issue, so it causes these weird deformations of fruits. It loves to feed off of fruiting structures. So anything like apples, grapes, birch, cherry, it's really a main issue of grapes. And so we have a pretty big grape industry here in North Carolina in the mountains, so that could be an issue. But it also can attack maple and poplars. So again, pretty much our trees are constantly under attack by whether it's plant pathogens or insects. Now, this was native to China. And so I would be remiss if I didn't talk about part of the life cycle, what its host plant it really likes. And its host plant that it really likes to reproduce on and to feed on is the tree of heaven, which I don't know if you guys are super familiar with it. It's pretty much everywhere. An example is of a tree of heaven is up there. There might be an area that's not well maintained or managed, and the tree of heaven can continue to grow. It's pretty prolific, makes its way all around. We work a lot with Carolina Wildlands Foundation with student interns, and they are constantly battling this tree of heaven down there, trying to maintain their forest.
So it's just.
What's that?
It's just.
It is misnamed in this case. It should probably be like the tree of pests, is what it should be. So again, we were talking about different characteristics of invasive insects. This has a really high reproductive rate. It also can basically feed on anything and still reproduce, although its preference is that tree of heaven. So it sort of starts that the eggs will be laid on a tree, and it sort of puts this waxy covering on there. That's how you know that those are the eggs. Then you have the different, what we call instars. So as it keeps molting until it finally gets to its final molt, it becomes an adult by July through December. Then it will begin laying eggs in around September. So it will be a while before it's truly here in Union County, but I'm going to be searching. I'll tell you that. Can't remember what county it was in, but you can use the map to find it.
It's each site.
That is a good question. I actually don't know enough about it to say for sure. But I would imagine so with hemipterans that with these true bugs, all in Hemiptera, all of these instars can feed with that long proboscis.
Oh, they're big in my house, those are my enemies.
Yeah, you probably noticed, yeah, the brown marmorated snake bug. This is more so an agronomic issue as far as economic losses rather than an ecosystem issue. Again, I feel like because I'm from Pennsylvania, so I feel like there's a lot going on there. First detected in the early 2000s there, so they've been around for a while. Just like the spotted lanternfly, these are also hemipterans, long proboscis. They prefer plants with a fruiting structure, so having any type of stone fruit, they'll feed on. And then it kind of has malformations of the fruit. Most people, right, you want to go to the store, you want a perfect type of fruit that has no blemishes. So that leads to about $37 million in orchard losses to date, which is kind of crazy. One paper I read, so really where it probably becomes an issue with us is in our house. They end up in your house. They are what we call true stink bugs. So as soon as they feel like they need to be in a defensive mode, they will release odors, and they're very unpleasant. But they also like to aggregate. So they also have the ability to release not only defense odors, but they release aggregation odors to say, hey, more brown marmorated stink bugs come here, and the goal is to mate. So that's how you can end up in this one study with over 26,000 brown marmorated stink bugs in somebody's house in a 180-day period.
Oh, my.
So we consider them more so a nuisance pest to a homeowner, but they're also an agronomic pest as well. And you can see in the map again, using my maps, I love them, that we have them here in North Carolina, and it sounds like you all have experienced them. There is the case though, where a lot of people get them confused with another type of stink bug, but it's important to note not that people like to get close to them like my mom does, and she's like, I just don't want to deal with them, but they have these sort of white areas, these bands on their antenna, and then they have this very distinct coloration on the outside of their hemelytra, whereas these guys don't really have that. You can't really see that, and there's no band in there. Yeah, this is native stink bug, native brown stink bug, and this is the invasive. But
Which one is the 26,000?
this one.
So if I had the other one, I'm almost there.
I mean, anyway you look at it, like stink bugs aren't great because they stink, so they have a really bad odor no matter, and they cause a great deal of damage. Like the southern green stink bug causes a great deal of agronomic damage to our crops, and they're not pleasant either. And sometimes they come in your house. Really, it's only like you'll only smell them if they feel like they're in danger. Like if you were to handle them, or they'll start spewing out that wonderful odor.
Are we bringing them in our potted plants or something? They're big as soon as you see them.
Yeah. No, not really. They a lot of insects have the ability to move in through cracks and crevices that you don't know about. So my brother is actually an entomologist as well, but he works with urban pests. And really, the one way that you can maintain a management strategy for your house is making sure that your windows and your doors, are completely sealed, and that if you have any type of cracks, you get some caulking and seal those cracks, and then you should be okay. I know, but you can pay a company a lot of money. Right. And there are a lot of pheromone traps that you can get. So if you're not wild about spraying pesticides in your house, which I don't, there's a lot of pheromone traps that you can buy that they'll just go to those rather than go. Or if it's in your house, you can put those traps out in your house and then they'll go to those pheromone traps. So for the rest of my talk, I'm going to focus on kudzu bugs because popping up on the internet. What are these things? Are they beetles? They're not. So like I mentioned before, with the last two examples, these are true bugs. They're hemipterans. They have this long proboscis. They have beady red eyes as well. They feed on kudzu, which is great. That's why they're called the kudzu bug. They can reduce the biomass of kudzu by 20 to 30%, which is pretty cool. But, and there's a big but, they like to feed on soybeans, and they can reduce the yield of soybeans up to 50. So in some cases, talking to some of my colleagues, they've seen it reduced by 70%. So not great when soybeans, pretty much everything that we eat has some sort of soy component to it.
And a lot of it, maybe now.
Lots of it, yep, very much so. I like it for my research because then I get to go out there and see if there's kudzu bugs on it, but I'm sure farmers are like, what are you doing? So they were first detected in Georgia. I made a typo there as I was typing. It's 2009, not 2019. That doesn't make any sense. 2009, I was actually in my PhD program, and my brother was wrapping up his master's. This was sort of a really cool serendipitous moment to just be alive. I was at the right place at the right time. A homeowner saw this bug on their wisteria. And they're like, what is this? So they sent it to our pest identification technician at Georgia. And she's like, I've never seen this before. So then my major PI, my brother's major PI professors, they all looked at it and they're like, this looks like a plataspid. And they're like, we don't have them here. They're native to Asia. So they got a scientist that studies plataspids, Joe Eager, who worked for Dow Chemical back then. And he's like, yeah, sure enough, it's a kudzu bug. We likely think that they came in, so right here in this area is where they were first detected. And if you know anything about geography of Georgia, that's where the Atlanta airport is. So from there, they kind of just exploded. I started at Wingate in 2010. And my whole goal was to sort of research them. And they're like, no, called cooperative extension. They're like, no, you can't do that. You need a permit. You need to go through APHIS. Like, they're invasive. I was like, okay, well, I bet you they're here. And they're like, no, they're not here. Like, they're not reported here. So I went out and took a couple students out in 2011, and sure enough, we found some on a kudzu patch on 200. And since then, we kind of went around surveying it, and you can kind of see in North Carolina, sort of, you have this whole area where it was able to be identified, and it corresponds to the I-85 corridor. And so what we learned is that they are able to hop on cars and hold on to cars for really long because they have these claws, and they're really good flyers. And also in those years, we had a lot of tornado outbreaks, and so they likely will also disperse during storms. And so that's how we were able to see them going all the way up here. They're as far now as Texas and Louisiana, as far north as Pennsylvania. Even though I'm from there, I didn't get that one. But it kind of follows the line of kudzu. What we're really concerned with is really that soybean belt. Are they capable of getting to the Midwest, and are they able to survive? Everything that I've mentioned about the characteristics of invasive species, technically they should be able to. But that's kind of where all of my research comes in, is can they really, what can we expect? And then I let the bigger scientists at the R1s sort of figure out all of the statistical computer models to say, is this going to happen? So since 2009, right, one of the things that I mentioned with invasive species, they just lack natural predators, they lack natural parasites, parasitoids, pathogens. Well, as we've been peeling back the onion on this, what we found is when a female, so we likely think a female was introduced here based on the DNA analysis. We also think there's a couple of egg sacs that were brought in on materials. What we were able to find through some other researchers is they found these two parasitoids that only will parasitize kudzu bugs in Florida. And so Oencertis emerges sort of, it kind of bites its way through the egg sac and emerges. These are kudzu bug egg sacs. And then Paralintomias comes right out of the top where the kudzu bug nymph should come. And so they found both of these, and they said likely what they think is that these parasitoids were already infested into the egg masses that came in. So they weren't introduced by Dr. Jones, but they're here naturally, and they're helping to control some of the kudzu bugs. Another thing that we found, and we found it here in North Carolina as well, which was another project of mine with my students, is, right, invasive species, they lack the pathogens, right, to control them, the parasitoids, the predators. And we actually had kudzu bug populations drop precipitously because they were infected with this fungus. This fungus is known as Bovaria bassiana. You can buy it on organicgrowers.com. You can spray it in your garden, and it's a great way to control biologically insect pests. The downside of spraying that is that it doesn't just attack the pests, it will attack other types of invertebrates. But these pictures are from, one is from the University of Georgia, the other one's from the University of, or Clemson University. And everywhere that there's white, those are kudzu bugs that have just been naturally infected with this Bovaria. Bovaria is in the soil. So based on seeing some of these epizootics, so how they got infected with it, I took a bunch of students around to kudzu patches, and lo and behold, we had kudzu bugs that were infected with this type of Bovaria. And we were able to determine that there's a couple different strains of this that's really lethal to these kudzu bugs. And so remember that I said with invasives, they're able to take over the nutrients and the spaces because they lack those predators, those pathogens, those parasitoids. And what we've seen with kudzu bugs in 2017, 2018, was it was almost impossible to find kudzu bugs. And that's likely because 1, we had this fungus infecting them. 2, we had the parasitoid wasp. And then we also had some really, really cold winters that they hadn't quite adapted to. And so we think those three variables are really what drop down their populations. But what goes down in invasive species world will come back up. And so now we've seen them completely rebound. And so part of my research was to look a little bit more at their temperature range. What were they really able to withstand? And so there's something, you don't need to understand this whole slide up here, but there's something called heat shock proteins that organisms have. So when they have environmental stress, like it's really high, they produce these proteins so that they can stay alive. And you only produce those proteins at certain temperatures when you're stressed. So I said, all right, let's stress these kudzu bugs. So we collected kudzu bugs and we put them into different incubators. And what we found was at 32 degrees Celsius is when they started to stress out. That's when they started to produce this protein the most. And then they kind of kept it on with 34. And then by the time we got to 40, so at 36, 38, 40 is when we started to see some of them start to die. So that's likely because why we don't see that protein being expressed as much. So that was kind of cool to see that the heat could also be more of an issue rather than the cold. So if we have really, really hot summers and they're exposed, now this experiment was there's no shelter, right? But if we looked at kudzu is the perfect environment because they can get out of the sun, get down to the soil. But what we've learned about the fungus lives in the soil, and we also might have parasitoid wasps. So if the heat's not the issue, then the fungi or the parasitoid wasps might be able to control this population. Thanks for hanging with me. This is my last slide. So I mentioned that invasive species can pretty much eat anything, feed on anything. Interestingly enough, in Japan's an island, obviously, but being an island had geographical constraints, and they had a species called Megacopta punctatissimia. And this particular kudzu bug looks the same as Pervasive, the one that's here in the United States. In Japan, this particular kudzu bug is the only one that can feed on soybean. And they're arguing it needs to be a completely different species because of the bacteria in its gut. But the kudzu bug here, the Pervasive that we have, feeds on soybean, it can feed on kudzu, it can feed on wisteria, it can feed on clover. It just can go all about. And so what my lab is doing now is we're looking at specimens we collected back in 2011, and we're comparing the gut microbiome from 2011 to now to see how it's different. And so the first thing that we see is the particular bacterium candidatus, which allows it to feed on soybean, was present in all those 2011 samples that we were able to detect. But it wasn't present in any of the 2022 samples that we collected. We couldn't detect it. So we don't know really what's going on there, but that is what determines whether or not it's a pest of soybean. The other interesting component is the 2011 sample. The size of the bacterium that's in the gut is different than the one from 2022. So we're not sure if over time, this bug has been able to manipulate and change its microbiome to feed on multiple hosts, or if it's the same and slightly altered. So that's our next step, is to kind of look to see how in the heck can it feed on all of these things and go back and forth with no problem. Well, in Japan, that's not the case. They can't move that rapidly. They're really small, like, so probably as big as your pinky fingernail. You will though. So they're not a stink bug, but they do also emit odors. And so they have aggregation odors. And likely where you will find kudzu bugs is a nuisance on the side of houses in the fall. They'll all aggregate to light colored houses in the fall from the kudzu patches. Light colored. So like white, yellows, light blues. Yes.
They seem to like those is their bark of choice.
They will. the medical facility up here on 74 where there's like Charlotte ear, nose, and throat. There's a really great kudzu patch, and then they have a bunch of different trees there. And you'll see the kudzu bugs on the trees in the bark. It's pretty cool. I don't know, they're fascinating creatures to me, but not to other people. Anyway, thank you for your time, and hopefully you learned a few things about kudzu bugs. Maybe. And that's all of my information in case you have any questions or like to get in touch with me.
I've got 2 questions from the
Okay.
folks at home. First one is, it's gonna be an interesting answer. He wants to know where there are the most gaps in research. In other words, what still needs to be studied about invasive insects. That's part 1. And then part 2, they're wanting to know if invasive insects are as destructive in their native region as they are here.
That's a great question. So typically they're, it kind of depends on specifically the species as to whether or not they're more destructive or not. But it also depends on your definition of what that is. Invasive species here are going to outcompete natives for nutrients for space almost always. Whereas in their native area, it just really depends on what they're feeding on. So if they're like, most invasive insects aren't very specifically tied to one type of plant. They're going to have the ability to feed on a lot of plants. In the case of insects that are specifically herbivores or generalists.
Where are the gaps?
Gaps. Well, I think we're doing a lot better job in researching invasive as soon as they get here. We don't know they're invasive until we find them. But really the biology of the invasive insect helps us understand more about its life cycle and know, like in the case of the boll weevil, how do we kill it? I don't know that we'll have an eradication program like that again, because it was heavy use of chemical pesticides, which is not necessarily great for the ecosystem. But it's trying to manage it and find all those biologicals, predators, pathogens, parasites.
I've lived in Florida for a while, and I think it's looks like ladybug or orange.
Yeah, so that harmonia species can be different colors. It could be like an orange, it could be a red, it could have spots, it may only have a couple spots, it could have a lot of spots. So it could be the same thing.
When people were banned in the trees, what was attacking the trees?
Well, if it's in Charlotte, there's a couple caterpillars that are defoliators of the 100-year-old trees in Charlotte. And so they're trying to, they're sticky traps that stick the caterpillars to stop them from feeding on the leaves. But then there's other ways to ban that are pheromone based, and that they're going to trap the insects depending upon what insect pest it is. But a lot of them, on the banded ones, are the ones that are crawling up the side of the tree.
Well, in my neighborhood, that's still some of the trees have that wrap around it.
Yeah, I can't remember the exact species of it, but
And I live in that.
yeah. I used to know it, and it's just leaving my brain right now. But
I was just curious.
yeah, that's what it's for.
Well, I got one more for you. If you could completely eradicate just one invasive insect, which one would it be?
But I can't because I love studying them. So, man, it would be the fire ants. They're just awful and mean, and it hurts, and it leaves scars on my legs, and it's terrible.
Oh, yeah.
That would probably be the one. Even though, interestingly enough, that's how I started in entomology, is studying fire ants. So,
Around here, we don't have red fire ants, so I know they're black and they're small. Are those still fire ants, or are they some kind of cross?
so we have European fire ants that are typically smaller. But the red imported fire ants have morphed so much that they tend, being that they're polymorphic, they can be different sizes and they can be different colors. So they might not always be red. So they might appear a little bit more black when you're looking at them than they look completely red. If they're like aggressive and stinging, that's still them. Because European ones aren't super aggressive, and they have much smaller mounds compared to the red imported fire ants. I really need my brother because he studied ants. You know, but then there's tiny Argentine sugar ants. There's white-footed ants.
Oh, those are nuisance.
Yeah.
What's the life cycle of
So it has 2 generations over the summer. When it emerges, you know, if we don't have any more crazy weather and it stays warm, it will emerge, lay eggs, and then those eggs will hatch in about a week to 2. You'll have the nymphs, and then around June and July, you will have another set of females lay eggs. And then when they become an adult, they'll overwinter in plant material in the fall until the next spring.
In that scenario that you were talking about, do the first mature females also overwinter, or do they just live one season?
No, they so they have 2 generations per season. So the adult female overwinters rather
than that season.
Mhm. Mhm. Which is a little bit different than other insects because they'll just lay eggs and the eggs overwinter. But also, like, we think that's the case. We don't truly know for sure. They're a bit elusive when it gets cold. Like, it's hard to find them and where they're at.
So is there anything natural you can put down from fire?
There's been instances where they've used boric acid and a little bit more, call it organic approach. Just please don't use gasoline and do not use water because it's not going to kill them with the water. They'll just move their mound somewhere else.
What if it's in the neighborhood?
Well, not going to suggest that on a recording.
I found, just before I got cold, the other day, I found a, I guess it was a gypsy moth caterpillar.
Yeah, it could be.
And those overwinter somewhere, so they emerge during the spring. Is that kind of normal for them?
It would be, but I also wouldn't be surprised because we had that long patch of really warm nights is really for insects. And we didn't really have a really, I know that we had a really cold freeze there around Christmas, but we didn't have a consistent amount of days where it was really cold and at freezing. So I wouldn't be surprised if there's more insects kind of popping out this year as compared to last year.
What's the predator of stink bugs?
There's some, they're called wheel bugs. Sometimes will be predators of different stink bugs, kudzu bugs, for instance. They have that long proboscis. Also, wheel bugs can be a predator of the spotted lanternfly as well. At least it's been documented. But it's not like in the case with the ladybird beetle where they're feeding and, you know, taking out thousands of aphids. It might be that we just see it, you know, one predating on one spotted lanternfly. So it's not really a great control system.
Well, there is a predatory stink bug too, correct?
Mhm.
I don't know that I've seen a lot around here, but I know there is one.
Yeah.
Smart lady, thank you.
You're welcome. Yeah, glad you guys enjoyed it.